Hello everyone, today we talk again about the connection between the late 16th century Dutch Nassau reforms and the classical treatises, as well, however, about the eventual implementation of these military precepts in actual warfare. And this video will not cover most of the latter aspect. I will have to make another one, but this sets a bit the premises. I already made a video about Maurice of Nassau and the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War. So especially the tactical essentials, like how did this armies operate on the field, and in what did their sort of innovation reform consist in concretely, which is the single most important thing consist in. And this is relevant, crucial, because of the further videos we'll make on the link existing between the Dutch reforms and the ones of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, about whom we also made, in fact, multiple videos explaining substantially what his innovations consisted in, etc. And we have already outlined the picture of actually a very gradual transformation, mostly based on the practical contingent needs of the effect of the theaters, the theaters in which these armies were operating, of course, the political and social background, but also the fact that the Dutch reforms were designed to be applied in part in just like, of course, in practice, but specifically within a relatively narrow theater that would remain, in fact, one of the Netherlands, but also and especially a political propagandistic one. That is to say, this part of these reforms never actually took place in the way, at least they were idealized and eventually spread, like sung by especially the Protestant propaganda, in order to, in fact, connect the United Provinces with a broader net of political alliances, and especially with the Protestant German principalities that did apply part of the Dutch. They attempted at least to reform their armies on the Dutch model, but that during the 30 Years' War, notoriously enough, were clamorously crushed by the Catholic forces, and it basically took the French and the Swedish to change that, and in fact bringing, say, the art of war itself further. But there is also another aspect regarding this that we will see, that is to say that the Catholic forces, starting from the leading Spanish, were actually implementing the same kind of reforms, and that, however, historiographically speaking, this has been not spread, popularized, which is the consequence of, first of all, the success of the Protestant propaganda, but also the fact that eventually military history in the contemporary era was largely led by the Protestant world, especially by the Anglo-Saxons, that sort of remained a bit within this ideological bubble of, okay, whatever the Dutch were writing about, copying these models from the ancient Greeks, right, would have allegedly worked. When, if you actually study the actual military history of this, and you realize that, of course, that was never applied, also because it would have not made sense, but especially that there wasn't a broader doctrine that the Dutch started, if not for their own armies, that eventually evolved, and actually the Dutch armies were really a cut spanning between the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, right? So 1 century before the reforms of Maurice of Nassau and the general house of Orange, but also this concept that fundamentally the Catholic forces would have remained sort of anchored to the old precepts of the old tercio, the 16th century pike square, incapable of moving, and etc., which is actually not true, right? The Spanish, even, like, there's no need even to look at the Austrians or the Bavarians, that the same Spanish were leading, right? Basically similar regimental reform, some what they called escadron, that were basically the 3,000 men, basically infantry plus cavalry, and that basically were the actual tactical, the definitive tactical unit on the battlefield, which is something that banally, like I'm not an expert, I'm just a medievalist, but studying early modern warfare, you immediately realize, I mean, just by the pictures of battles, that that big square just with the arquebusiers on the corners, etc., is something you see just around the 16th century. If you look at battles of the 30 Years' War, you realize that imperial forces are but also even the ones of the 80 Years' War were something different. And we will see all these things better in some other video, but today I want to focus especially on the Hellenic model that the Dutch were inspiring themselves to, in part the ideological reasons, that some are also funny and fascinating from a historical point of view. In other words, as we'll see now, the Dutch saw themselves as the Carthaginians, and they saw the Spanish as the Romans instead, and they were trying to make parallelisms on the between the strategies like of the Second Punic War and the 80 Years' one. Also, we will see the influence of these treaties in the broader European context, and how since the 16th, the 17th century, this idea that the Dutch success in the Netherlands against the Spanish in a broader strategic and political sense would have been connected with some tactical accomplishment that was completely ideal and was not actually what you would have found in the Dutch armies, in Dutch warfare of the time, right? More of that. In any case, talking about treatises is important because, in fact, the same history that we have today, in order to understand that type of warfare, was pretty much the same on which the contemporary authors, say from other countries, based themselves. Of course, they use these works in very different ways than the way we do now, and I say it in a positive sense for them compared to us, because it's incredible actually how historiography went on pushing the same narrative again, of the great tactical reform of the Dutch during this period, etc. While these texts are evidently just trying to do something else, successfully, by the way, from a political point of view for the Netherlands, but not, with the tactical aspect coming really to the last place, even for them, right? Because these were the same commanders, by the way, who at least commissioned these works, or even wrote them, and that, however, had commanded their armies and knew perfectly what the reality actually was. So it's always like with a lot of I don't understand why people today are fixated with propaganda, mostly because we live in a time of lesser people being able to say whatever they want, and so we are constantly bombarded by through the social media of this idea that everything is a scam, that history is wrong, is written by the winners, that there is a major truth hidden, that this is a mental illness, right? Just a gravely underschooled person reasons like that, and especially the people who never studied history in the first place, nor sources, and haven't the palest idea of how to handle them. But one of the most fascinating things sociologically and historically is to see that propaganda, that is just a neutral term that can even push for actually good, objective, informed content, like not something false, like you can find as well, but not necessarily. And still, we repeat in many ways propaganda from centuries or even millennia ago by, in fact, some politics, some institutions, some figures that had a very specific political reason to do so, and that somehow, because of their grandiosity, passed down to history as such, and people just repeat this. And you would think this applies just to the masses, to the mob, but it does happen also to the scholars, because ever since scholars come from the fourth estate themselves, unfortunately that's the level of the quality. So during the 16th and the 17th century, there is an extension of treatises, because for the first time the army's complexity, cost, and size overall render it necessary to try to sort of draft a minimal manualistic basic to illustrate, just to prepare, especially the commanders, of what essentially armies would have been. But in this age, and we made multiple videos on this, it's still largely just an ideal, an abstract, propagandistic, a cultural thing. It's not really, you use this manual and you actually get well informed about what you should do, more or less. You have to await von Clausewitz to have a full picture of that, more or less. That's what it starts being prevalently from the 18th century, speaking of treatises. And actually, about this authority method of quoting classical authors, also in the 18th century, that is in many ways the age of neoclassicism, etc., and still the ancien regime is based on, of course, the ancient universal tradition, right, of nobility and more, is just part of the deal, right? It's a literary expedient in some way. And some guys, however, took this more seriously, and especially they began as classicism, say philology, literature, history during the Renaissance was advancing philologically, to say, look at Greek soldiers, look at the Roman soldiers, and let's try to uniform our armies today more or less the way they did, with this type of discipline, this type of order, etc. And again, it's nothing particularly serious just per se. We have seen it in some battle plans, for example, from the times of Charles the Bold for the Burgundian army, and there were these divertissements, if you want, about just before the battle, and drawing very complex battle formations, etc. And you realize from the battles that absolutely these formations were not applied. Everything was much simpler, much more concrete. And in many ways, this is true for this time, or even more, given that, of course, the more you go on, especially with firearms, the more all this looks a completely different thing in terms of strength ratios, tactically speaking, than the classical war. But writers of late antiquity, such as Vegetius, this one literally the only source that was read in a military sense in Western Europe, right, in Latin, so most of the foundation of this classical influence during the Middle Ages were read, and to having become actually an authority, even though Vegetius states himself that he didn't understand much about warfare. And that, interestingly enough, you see how much we are children, not just of the Greeks, but of the Byzantines in a way, that was saying himself that he was actually just looking at the old days of, say, early imperial Rome, in that he was just going by example, and so imitating classicistically, like, I don't know, even Ananna Komnena could have done. In any case, these works were, of course, we're talking Renaissance Europe, so just classical civilization dominates at every level. These works are read and received as if these authors themselves were contemporaries. And when you read certain works, indeed, they were. I mean, if you read Polybius, it seems like his work is being written by a guy nowadays. I mean, you immediately understand it. That's how Western we truly are, right? When you read Sun Tzu, it's not the same thing. Well, he's contemporary of figures like Pythagoras, but of course it's just a completely different type of mindset, and also actually a much more mediocre one to some extent. Compared to the West, contrarily to what people really believe, never compare von Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, if anything, for respect to your own intelligence. In any case, there was a conviction that and it was not in absolute terms wrong, that the principles of war and politics had remained unchanged, right? Which is true in a truly universalistic and traditionalistic way, except, of course, these decline themselves differently into reality, which is a different thing. And also, people have trouble with like saying war changes. War never changes. Like if you read the font here, I have the von Clausewitz's Avatar for a reason. Like if you focus on what war concretely is and how it is fought, it is always the same. Like it's a universal. It's a scientific and moral condition. It's not a way of saying, okay, well, then I use a plane. It's a different way of war. Everything has changed. War now because we have drones. Like war is different. No, right? War is always the same. And in fact, the most idiotic military actions in many ways derive from this disgusting, fourth estate or chthonic, telluric, deterministic materialism and technologism and progressism and more. In any case, again, the general inspiration that a prince from the ones of Nassau would draw was useful to start building, in fact, the theory that allows us today, for example, to compare more objectively, for example, different commanders. One of the most favorite exercises of these guys was to make some sort of tactical summas, comparing among each other Gustavus Adolphus, Turenne, Condé, but also figures like Aristotle, Moses, Judas Maccabeus, and Thomas Aquinas concerning war, but also as commanders, in the case of those who had been commanders. This was incentivized by some classical works themselves. Think about Plutarch's Parallel Lives. In particular, the classic of all classics, the confrontation between Hannibal and Scipio towards the end of the 16th century interested the commands of the Protestant armies that in the Flemish rebel provinces were fighting against the Spanish Empire. As we were saying before, why these guys? Well, there was another Catholic field, right? Those, for example, Italians that sided with the Spanish, with the Empire, that were at the center of the Renaissance as scholars, at least thought differently, and instead, a prince like William Louis of Nassau would write a brief treatise on the military history of the Second Punic War, especially reevaluating Hannibal, right? Not just because he was the most famous enemy of the Romans, so the great imperial Catholic empire, so mirroring the Spanish, but because he had repeatedly defeated the same Romans and almost actually annihilated the same urbs politically, even before then militarily. So this is quite interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, what I always say, if you want to study in detail, like in depth, with all the sources available for once in your life, it can take years. One war in general, this is a big task, but because it's multiple campaigns, but it's also ancient sources. There are not so many as, say, the 16th century ones. Study the Second Punic War, because the Second Punic War, didactically speaking of the art of war, is the single most complete one in the history of mankind, right? It's there is so much behind that. I made a video about the moral superiority of Roman civilization. It sort of explains what was at stake there. I, strangely enough, made at least few videos about the Second Punic War, but it's something we have to delve into the utmost detail because it's really big. I studied it at some time and say it's just the type of cyclical topic choices that prevented us to just explore it more. But the other thing here that is fascinating is, in fact, how a Dutch ruler would essentially identify, in this sense, with Hannibal, because of course the Spanish were more powerful than the Dutch, as much as the Romans were more powerful than the Carthaginians. But Hannibal, of course, had managed to inflict the Romans horrendous defeats, plus on the Italian territory. So flipping in many ways the condition, even though that was basically the only one he could ever, and he was the only guy who could do that tactically, beaten the Romans. The Romans went close to defeat. I mean, after Cannae, actually, Hannibal was much more impactfully traumatized by the level of cohesion of the Romano-Italic confederacy that was shockingly granitical, to say the least, after this massive bath of blood, than in fact the Romans had suffered for the latter in the first place. Right? That really showed what the Romans were made of. Right? I made a series about how the Romans had come to consolidate the Romano-Italic confederacy through centuries, literally, of non-stop warfare, and this molded, in fact, the single most powerful and divinely chosen people in the history of mankind. So there is a lot at stake there. Until the Battle of the Metaurus River, Hannibal, the Carthaginians, could make it. Right, it ended there. Right, but Cannae already had shown that basically Rome was extremely more courageous than what the Carthaginians themselves thought. And this is interesting because, of course, with the 80 Years' War, the Dutch won in the end, but as we will see now, it had nothing to do with the Second Punic War, nor with the Punic comparison, of course, right? But it's fascinating to look at people like William Louis of Nassau, for example, reading the account of Polybius about the same battle of Cannae, right? For which the Dutch ruler was inflamed by the idea of having found the secret of a decisive victory, and he thought, in fact, to repeat the Pugna Cannensis to destroy the entire Spanish army of Flanders. This, at least, was written, again, reality is also another matter, these people knew that, but still, in a letter dated to 1595 to his cousin and comrade in arms, Maurice, the Prince of Orange. Both, of course, were at the head of the Protestant rebel armies in Flanders, so they were the leaders of the revolt, and they were toying with these ideas. Interestingly enough, Maurice, as you know, was the son of William the Silent, right? A guy that had initially, of course, cooperated with Charles V, Philip II, and Maurice would have been William Louis' successor as Stadtholder and General Captain of the United Provinces. By the way, if you're interested in William Louis of Nassau's work, published in Den Haag in 1675, its title is Hannibal, it's in French, Escipient où le grand capitaine avec les ordres et plein de batailles, et les annotations, discours et remarques politiques et militaires. And there is an interesting comparison that was made by some scholars, for example, Halberg, regarding the strategic ratio of strength between Protestants and Spanish in Flanders during those same years. That would have been respectively 40 and 70,000 men, right? And this was objectively and randomly similar, comparable to the one of the Carthaginians and the Romans at the Battle of Cannae. However, in fact, it's a completely different strategic situation, aside from the fact that Cannae is, of course, eventually the battle in itself. The main divide, however, being that in Flanders, the majority of the troops was distributed among the various garrisons, which would reduce the total of the mobile forces to not more than 10, maximum 15,000 men per side. Generally, during the Second Punic War, the troops were much more concentrated, right? Even when, say, the Romans were avoiding after Cannae, so because that was the only strategic choice available. Like, people think that Quinctus Fabius Maximus won the Second Punic. Absolutely not, right? It was Scipio in Spain and in Africa that did, right? If it had depended on the Cunctator, that would have been like a third or fourth Punic War and more. Plus the third would have not been that joke that it would turn out to be after de facto the after Carthaginian defeat by the hands, in fact, of the Africanus. But it's still interesting to, say, medicinate yourself into these commanders and thinking, like, well, in the midst of all the war, of the political tensions, the incredible stress, whether these people were so attached to history and to the art of war in general that they were writing to each other these things. Like, we're like, just like in the Second Punic War, if you read Polybius, you can see what was going on, and we could use these tactics against and strategies against the Spanish, etc. Which was a thing, because, say, the idea of defeating an enemy in constant numerical superiority and continuously replenished of men and money through the strategic corridors of the Flemish road, right, the Spanish road, right, across Central Europe, was so, suggestive, was so enticing that at the end it convinced Louis of Nassau of its validity, albeit the same Louis, in front of, say, of the different historical reality, was obliged to recognize that in war, especially, quantity is also a quality as such, because the Dutch were trying again to seek a tactical superiority, like the Hannibalic one on the Romans, at least until figures like Nero and Scipio. The Romans were learning, but they also were much more, again, they were superior politically and strategically to the Carthaginians in the first place. The Dutch were instead minuscule compared to the Spanish Empire, such. So, as we've seen also in other videos, they could have not attained that level of structural quality that the same capacity of handling quantity gives you, and they didn't even have quantity to begin with, right? So, of course, these aspects do matter a lot, right? And also the way the Spanish were managing the Spanish road is incredibly relevant. Now, to bring Louis a bit back on earth was in fact his cousin Maurice, that instead used to cite the dictum transmitted by Vegetius and eventually resumed by Machiavelli, that you essentially would have had to go to battle only in case of a greater force from your side, or of a crushing superiority in general over your enemy, which is let's say it's a cautious, right, a prudent way of thinking that stems from a bit the late Roman obsession for preserving demographic resources, and that is also applicable, like, to many. For example, the same Machiavelli, if you look at the Italian states that were very sort of mercantile minded to some extent, like preserving as much, especially Florence, that didn't like to spend much for its armies, with the obvious consequences of that. I mean, the fact of actually being knocked out eventually. There is an important reference to figures we'll see now, Wallhausen, but especially in this case Justus Lipsius, that had been the teacher of Maurice at the University of Leiden between 1583 and 1584. I made a video about the Protestant influence, say properly the theological influence on the development of modern discipline, which I dedicated again a video to, and I discuss Justus Lipsius' thoughts. There is also the one on Wallhausen that we will perhaps discuss better on another day. And Justus Lipsius was a supporter, actually, of the superiority of the Roman system on the modern one. The Romans in their time were, of course, powerful thanks to the political reasons why they were able to mobilize such large amounts of forces next to their stark quality. And consider that Lipsius terminated his work De Militia Romana Libri Quinque, which is a commentary on Polybius, on March the 15th, 1594. There were two editions of this work in 1595 and 98 respectively. And then in 96 he published the Poliorceticon Sive de Machinis Tormentis Telis Libri Quinque. So this was about siege warfare fundamentally. It was an enormous interest in siege warfare, especially during the Dutch revolt, because you know that basically the Dutch defeated the Spanish at siege warfare. Like Maurice conquered city after city after city. And what we were saying before about this, I mean, the fact of remaining entrenched was quite relevant for both sides, but especially for the Dutch, because in open field they were inferior to the Spanish. And so they had to carry out a sort of a strategy, in fact, was more resembling the one of Quintus Fabius Maximus from the Roman side into the Second Punic War than Hannibal's one, right? And these influences, again, are all over because Lipsius, again, informed dramatically in Nassaus thinking, right? This book about the Poliorceticon was reprinted in 1599 and 1605 and 6. So Justus Lipsius is an interesting figure. We will have to talk about him again. Just know that this sort of Dutch reform, if we can't speak even properly about reform, was deeply informed theoretically by the University of Leiden and this scholar. In the spring of 1593, the octogenarian Spanish commander Peter von Mansfeld tried repeatedly to provoke Maurice to open battle, but the Dutch prince behaved, in fact, exactly as Quintus Fabius Maximus towards Hannibal in this context. It would be a repeated pattern. You see, this is why essentially the Protestant German armies failed during the 30 Years' War before the intervention of the Swedes, that were something very different. And in fact, because also the actual adaptation of the Dutch model to the broader Central European theater, because as you know, Gustavus Adolphus had been fighting against the Poles, against different types of opponents as well. And in fact, he tried to give, for example, more backbone, more robustness. He even proportionally increased in the Swedish army the importance of the pike, rather than insisting on firepower, as at least the Dutch were, as we will see now, tendentially trying to do. And the sense was, in fact, that still the Catholic armies had bigger armies, not because they were more doctrinally obsolete or they didn't want to abandon those bigger formations, but because they could afford in the first place to arm them, right? And in fact, also the tactical successes of the Protestants during the 30 Years' War mostly come from the reapproach into some larger level of operational capacity that the Dutch, as most Protestant German armies, could not quite afford in open field, right? You really needed the French money and the Swedish army to do so, right? And even with mixed results, where you realize that the Catholic forces were capable of inflicting, bloody losses still to the most, tactically insightful and updated Protestant armies of that war, throughout which basically we were talking about it regarding the potential firepower during the 30 Years' War was not really unhinged, in spite of the fact that also the Catholics were experimenting, and also successfully, with more tactically dynamic systems. So the great quantity and effectiveness of the new, for example, bastion fortresses of the Dutch, and the constant and chronic lack of money that produced continuous mutinies in the Spanish armies for, in fact, the protracted conflict and the lack, especially, of pay, imposed without alternative an attritional warfare also from the Dutch side that could inflict these losses on, again, who is the strongest, he who has the strategic initiative, right, though he's going on the offensive, and which doesn't mean that he will win, but in this sense the Dutch could not were good at defending, and they would have not had essentially the capacity to do otherwise, and this was evidently a very different picture than the tactically dynamic one that, for example, the Second Punic War renders to us. It was all about this. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans, as you know, were fixated with major pitched battles, and I will not digress explaining why in the history of the art of war you had at that point this greater concentration of major engagement, which is also sort of illusory from a perspective point of view, because they talk a lot about these bigger battles. Yes, there were bigger powers to some extent, but it's also about the contingency, and there were lots of smaller battles anyway that are not documented. In any case, this was, to say it the German way, a Stellung, a Stellungkrieg rather than a Kesselschlacht. Right, Kesselschlacht is cauldron battle. Right, the idea that basically you surround the enemy and then you pour everything in, right, to eat him alive, basically, which was essentially what the Hannibalic model was. Think about Cannae, like literally attracting the Romans, exploiting their strengths and their Schwerpunkt, which is not always the same thing. Telling the truth, many people equivocate that also in the Clausewitzian theory, but right, eventually enveloping them with wings, with the cavalry, and cutting them down in a major slaughter. Well, this in late 16th century Flanders was definitely not possible, right? There were, however, some occasions to do so at a smaller level, right? On January the 24th, 1597, at Turnhout, famously enough, Maurice of Nassau took the initiative to attack an Habsburgic force of 5,000 men. It was more of an ambush to some extent. Like the two armies didn't conventionally deploy for a pitched battle or whatever. But it's an interesting clash that at some point perhaps we will make an in-depth video on. But it's worth mentioning at that point the Dutch army was made up by 2/3 of English forces. That, by the way, sucked in terms of doctrinal advancement. I mean, you know that England, basically after the 100 Years' War, remained substantially backwards compared to the continental military developments until the New Model Army, right? So this is not even to say that you need the best, the most advanced troops, whatever. I also made a video about the Battle of Gavelin, for example, where there is a first naval bombardment of these English ships that randomly passed by the beach where the French and Imperials were fighting, and they resolved the matter. This is somewhat similar, but always bear in mind that the Dutch, and also later on, also thanks to their increasing wealth, to say the least, would have notoriously a mercenary foreign army as their own, right? And this is to be considered also when we think about how much control did they really have even on the... Well, at some point they did, but at this point, for example, the battle was decided in favor of the Dutch by the cavalry, by the way, not even the infantry in a, say, classical sense, supported by 300 English musketeers that basically took from the rear the Tercio de Nápoles, commanded by the Marquis of Trevico. This episode is important because it is one of the most important Dutch successes in open field, so daring to come out, even though the most famous in absolute terms is, of course, the Battle of Newport of July the 2nd, 1600. An important clash well worth an in-depth video. That is also often portrayed like, oh, look at this changed everything the Dutch had brought to the fore, there's new tactics, whatever. But as we will see now, so just by the strength ratio, there is something more than that, circumstantially, that favors the rebels. The military reputation of Maurice of Nassau up to that point had, as we were remembering, derived from the numerous cities that he had managed to strip the Spanish of in the years 1590-91, right? And these operations had been often based on coups, like in say some incursions, surprise attacks of sort, and or with political rather than military means. This is also very common, right? I had the luck of studying some late medieval warfare coups, right, of cities, and it's not that different actually from the 16th century. And this was in many ways also considering the increasing effectiveness of fortifications and the staticization of siege warfare that I made multiple videos on throughout all this period. One of the most convenient ways, like you have somebody who open the door, the gates, let some party in, the garrison is taken over, the city rebels, things like that. But again, the Battle of Newport, for this reason, stands out because it's a big open field engagement. An incredibly bloody one for the Spanish field army that lost in the engagement a half of its troops, which is really remarkable. The Spanish had basically been attracted in a pretty broken terrain by high water because of the sea tide, and by the same foraging and logistical needs connected with harvesting, like the agricultural activities scattered on that territory. And it basically ended up, as a consequence, in the crossfire of the Dutch fleet and of the 6 cannons that had been placed at the foot of the dunes and served by some sailors that had been disembarked from the sea. But the reality was that the operation was imposed onto Maurice, right, strategically, and politically as well. He actually complained a lot about this. Maurice is an interesting figure. It was a kind of a magnetic, introverted sort of... it's an interesting mind to explore. He had been protesting. He had been actually going against the Dutch General Estates, the parliament, that actually did not care about dislodging the Spanish from western Flanders, as Maurice would have preferred, but only, in fact, putting an end, essentially, to the devastating privateering carried out by the ship owners of the only 2 coastal towns that had remained in Spanish control, in fact, Newport and Dunkirk. This is interesting. I made a video about piracy in these centuries, mostly look at the Americas, etc. But there is a lot going on in the same Europe, and we'll come back on this topic as well. But what does this contrast between Maurice and the general estates of Holland really remind you in this context? A bit the one between Scipio and the Roman Senate, or at least the opposite party, led in fact by Quintus Fabius Maximus, even though Maurice wanted to get it over it with a broader strategic accomplishment that would have brought him greater power. The general estates instead did not want to pay too much and feared this guy that was becoming very powerful. But he had actually, in this case, had to obey the Senate, let's say, and convinced that the mutiny of the Spanish veterans would prevent the Archduke Albert to come to the relief of Newport, the general estate ordered to Maurice to gather 13,000 men in Zealand, and after having crossed the Scheldt estuary, marching along the coast, supported logistically and with the guns of the fleet. So Maurice himself was actually surprised when he learned that once the Spanish veterans had been placated, the Archduke had been marching towards the maritime stronghold with 9,000 men, which were enough, of course, to seize. The city had not a Protestant army intervened. So the English general Francis Vere, that was lieutenant of Maurice and commander of the Dutch vanguard, that would take most of the Dutch losses at the Battle of Newport, and author, by the way, of the commentaries of the Flemish War. Sir Charles Oman drew a lot from this source. Basically, he based the analysis of the campaign on Vere. Actually doesn't speak that well of Maurice, right? Remember, here the English made most of the work, or at least they were decisive to an extent, especially in the battle, and instead of waiting for the enemy attack on those predisposed positions, or to march directly and decisively against the Archduke, Maurice sent to hopefully block his passage only 2,500 men. So there's a very, very cautious, a very limited force, not to commit larger one. And in fact, these men were annihilated by the Imperials, thus uselessly sacrificed. And this sacrifice wouldn't either prevent the Spanish from reaching the beach north of Newport, essentially cutting the Dutch retreat on Ostend and obliging them to fight with a sort of flip front, that is to say, with their backs towards the city, and essentially locked between the dunes and the beach. So what happened later with the shifting of the battle from the beach to the dunes and the final collapse of the Spanish cavalry that provoked panic and the rout of their infantry were caused in part, we will see this better actually in the battle, by the high water, and in this sense even more than by the tide high waters than by the command of Maurice of Nassau, that indeed remained the master on the field. But he wouldn't chase the Archduke, and not even the garrison of Ostend came out of the town to capture the Archduke Albert, the imperial commander. Maurice was furious with the General Estates because of all the mess that, after all, had occurred. Yes, the Dutch had won, but there had been this general, risk and sort of crazy situation produced against the will of the same commander, and this brought actually to the abortion of the siege that could have been carried out against Newport, and strategically, as a consequence, the initiative was rendered back to the Spanish, who actually advanced along the coast. They improved their defensive line by conquering Ostend, to the price, objectively, of a harsh siege that lasted from 1601 to 1604. This tells you how static a warfare was still, because of the fortifications. At this point, the Trace Italienne was out there. It was everything was contracting ever more. Again, I made specifically a video about this to explain how a great part of the doctrinal problems connected to Pike&Shot warfare weren't just about pitched battles, but to siege warfare as well. I mean, those armies were strategically contextual to, in a greater sense. This siege was incredibly attritional, and in fact it brought the Spanish and the Protestants to a long truce starting in 1607, which would be broken only in 1621. That is still part of the 80 Years' War, but it overlaps in this case with the beginning of the 30 Years' War from Bohemia to Germany, thus reawakening in some way the Flemish national spirit and the entire Netherland front, right? So already at Tournus, but especially Newport, you can see what the new, say, Dutch tactics were about, right? Mostly the employment of musketeers that in Europe up to this point we were to see like always the previous influence, right? This is what the Swedish would look at, but the Dutch here were looking in turn at what the Huguenots had carried out during the French confessional wars, and essentially perfected by Louis of Nassau, whose regulations were eventually to be re-exported to France, and where the Huguenots were still there, until Louis XIV's times, and in the Protestant countries mostly, by those same officers that had foreign officers, like from those very countries that had participated, as we've seen, just like now, like a guy like Veer, to the revolt, and had been dismissed with a truce of 1607 from the Dutch army, right? And if you read, by the way, these regulations that were still mixed with the various classical references, etc., in fact, the references to the Roman legions, for example, were all over the places. For example, there was Montgomery that wrote La milice françoise contenant plusieurs belles et notables instructions sur ce qui doit être observé ou bien ordonné de bataille, dresser des bataillons situés places et forteresses, et les moyens de les attaquer et défendre. Pratiquer de plus grands capitaines tant anciens que modernes. This was published by François Étranger in Paris in 1636. You have the Sieur de Pressac that wrote the Discours et questions militaires, published in Paris in 1614. There is Jean de Billon in Lyon, 1641, publishing Le Principe de l'Art Militaire. The same republished, in yeah, I think in 1641, the same one, the Destruction Militaire, in 1617. So this is actually a lot of stuff that began to circulate, as we will see now, spreading a certain idea of the Dutch army, based, however, on some specific models that had not necessarily been attained, right? The Dutch model, as we have observed in the videos about the Swedish army of the 30 Years' War, had been essentially improved or just taken as an inspiration and developed on another base by Gustavus Adolphus from 1630. This was a new tactical system, as we've seen, that privileged mostly combined arms and as such firepower to an unprecedented extent, especially at closer range, and in fact aimed at maximizing properly the strength of these arms rather than the cooperating with one another as much as they could in a synergic way. It seems that, of course, these ideas had been around for a while. I mean, if you had asked any commander of the era, like what they would have liked to see, they would like, of course, to maximize all these factors, but not always they would have had the chance to do so, right? The same Louis of Nassau had written to Maurice, for example, from Groningen on December the 8th, 1594. Aelianus would be a very important source for the Dutch, and we will explain essentially why. Maurice had in his library, that included 402 works in 432 volumes, two translations of Aelianus. The French one of Nicolas Volquier, that had been published in Paris in 1536, and the Latin one of Francesco Roberelli, De Militaribus Ordinibus Instituendis More Grecorum Liber. This had been published in Venice in 1552. The Protestants liked the Venetians because even though they were Catholic, they had kept the Inquisition out. They didn't have a censorship on their writing, so Venice had become quite a place, like as a major Renaissance capital, to find all these books, even for Protestant travelers. There was also the translation, the Latin one, of Leo, dedicated to Henry VIII of England. This shows you not only how much these treatises circulated, but how much philologically, let's say, criticized they were, because just even having different translations from different languages, not much because you may have not known ancient Greek, but because you would have compared even how different authors would translate that and interpret it in some way, because in a sense they were thinking how to apply these methods to the contemporary military is fascinating. Now, Aelianus is really important for the Dutch for a very curious but very interesting reason. It was, as you know, a work destined to Emperor Trajan, and it was not much concerned with the Roman legions of his time. Trajan was himself one of the greatest commanders in Roman history. But in fact, the tactics of the early types of phalanxes, the Spartan or politic one and the Macedonian one, that were a bit sort of the most important in antiquity by technical standards. And this work included attention, in fact, on the so-called choreos, that is the choreography, a sort of ring of roses, incredibly important because it was carried out in Aelianus by light infantry around the hoplitic formation to essentially bombard of darts, javelins, arrows, and slingshots, whatever, the enemy front. This immediately should make you ring something about Pike&Shot warfare, especially if you have listened to my video about the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War. Because the Dutch were seeking here to do pretty much the same, to find a way to maximize firepower around the Pike Square. Dutch would at some point find a way to, for example, not exposing their musketeers, as we will see, were particularly costly. And at this point, the Dutch were still to rise to that financially level that would allow them to have actually, as we were saying before, at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, actually the strongest army in Europe in terms of cost-benefit ratio from a strictly economical point of view. I mean, these were the guys who stopped the French army of Louis XIV, right? So, just saying, strongest army in Europe, by the way, next door to Holland, right? And that basically revolved around a sort of dance that would make these guys go around and jump and shoot in the moment in which they passed behind the enemy formation's gap, right, formed by two units, so that they could reach the enemy that was on the other side. That would have hopefully been hidden, and this could go on with the cover of the pikes. Among the other things, it was not the only way the Dutch naturally used their musketeers, as we will see now. But this text became immediately very relevant in the Netherlands because, in fact, of the similarity that was spotted between the legionary and Macedonian formations of antiquity and the massive pike regiments used by the Spanish, especially. Again, the Dutch would fight in the same Pike&Shot fashion, except they had smaller contingents on a regular basis. They tried. Aside from whom could field what, for example, the term legion was very widespread, as we've seen in those works by the foreign officers that had served in the Dutch army during the revolt against the Spanish. As we know, we've seen in the video about the French native infantry of the Italian wars, and there had been an attempt by the King Francis I in 1534 to create officially in France these 7 great units of provincial infantry, essentially called legions, that would perform quite disappointingly, given that nobody in France really wanted or had the capacity, not even the king, to an effective extent of creating really a new class of militarized infantry in a country was dominated by feudalism. This was attempted in Germany. The Landsknechten were actually a positive result because Germany was all more politically fragmented. In France, it was much more of a sort of iron arm with the nobility. At the end of the Italian wars, of course, the French had their own French infantry, full Pike&Shot guys, after having used and abused of the Swiss. If you're interested, there are some works on the reforms proposed in 1548 by Raymond de Beccarie, the Marquis of Forqueville, who was observing this general, say, lack of the French in infantry that, had it been gapped, would have made the French win the Italian wars, because France was the largest country, and if they had set their mind on creating an actual national force of pikemen, they would have basically steamrolled everyone. But again, the aristocracy was not legitimately, by the way, feeling like it would have been a good idea. The same Spanish tercio, so the strongest army in Europe at the time, was actually called legion, like the various tercios were called legions. And this tells you immediately, of course, we are in the full Renaissance, so everybody is literally obsessed with anything traditionally connected with the Greeks, with the Romans, the capacity of recovering that sort of absolute power of great, uniform, disciplined armies to create world empires, like in fact the ones that the same Spanish are affirming at this point. And there is legitimately an exaltation as far as this is concerned. There is a anthropologically definitely a sense. For example, firearms, even though they didn't really change things from a day to another, it took half of a millennium to pass from the pike to the musket for good. The capacities of modern states to finally gathering much larger forces than needed dramatically, not just many resources, but also properly the technique to uniform, to train, to discipline, etc. was feeling these guys empowered in many ways. This was a fruit of also the ancien regime control on the communities, on the countries, more. So the specific interest for Aelianus stood even more specifically in the accurate description of three types of countermarch. We'll talk more about the countermarch. Essentially, this is a maneuver that I talk about it in the Spartan drill video. And this is a way that allows you to essentially change front fast without messing up the formation within that has, as you know, an inherent coherence, right? You don't just turn every guy inside the formation 180 degrees if you have to go backwards, right? You must have to the entire file turn around following the same guy, because the entire formation is structured like that. If you mess that up, that formation is gonna suck in the first place. Like that was several years ago, like a humanistic video circulating like crazy. Like they weren't claiming it was a serious thing, but just changing front, turning around with like 10 guys in a gym, like and everybody, oh my god, look at how they changed front. No, they didn't change front like that, right? That's what an idiot thinks an army can change front like. And the Renaissance commanders were quite sensitive about this, because naturally pike squares were the fruit, first of all, of an unprecedented level of collective discipline that required, in fact, that entailed, first of all, the handling of a major steamrolling force that, however, was such in virtue of its internal order. And so if you were able to address more functionally this order toward direction and another faster than the enemy, but maintaining order, you had an edge of sometimes decisive sort, right? So these ancient manuals were circulating for the various solutions that, after all, you see, the Greeks were very theoretical, right? They cared so much about these geometric patterns and the order, whatever. Then this is not that these things were not done. These were done by everyone. I also made a video explaining how, of course, the Romans didn't adopt any kind of phalanx in their history, contrary to what most people still incredibly believe, but they did adopt, in fact, what is the actual tactica in Greek. That is the battle. It's the order of the formations, which is a concept, right? That is the product also of a certain stage of civilizational development. Well, Aelianus was listing, this is in fact the 2nd century AD source of these were already in that sort of Greek fashion, resuming the older times models, even in a very notionistic philological way. So these three types of countermarch were the Greek, the Macedonian, and the Hellenistic one. So Hellenistic intended like a different one from the Macedonian during the Hellenistic era, through which you could essentially ensure a continuous throw of weapons by the side of the lighter troops in the Renaissance, because this countermarch was conceived at the time, of course, for the phalangites, so the heavy infantry, the pikemen, but it could be adopted for the same musketeers in the 17th century, and still entailed that sort of ring-a-ring arose to harass the bigger pike formations. It was being illustrated by Aelianus, even in this kind of countermarch for the same lighter troops. So this is really really important. And Louis of Nassau thought to dispose the musketeers in lines of, say, 10 men deep, eventually reduced to 6 by Gustavus Adolphus, or that would have, in this sense, just alternated themselves, firing one after the other. Gustavus Adolphus would be credited with essentially make them, say, shoot all at once, so to maximize especially the aim, and especially at a closer range. In this time, the idea was having one line firing after the other, but after, in fact, the one head shot, like defiling, literally behind, at the end of the row, recomposing there, and reloading the weapon, advancing as long as the various lines fired, and retreated in the same way, and opening fire again. This had all some technical limitations. We made some videos about how complicated it was to maintain this order, right? It was, let's say, maintaining the order of these troops was less relevant than the heavy infantry, because first of all, they had an open one. Still at this time, musketry technology had to. Still, there was also passage from the arquebus and the muskets at some point, and actually, it wasn't even a strict uniformity in that categorical sense, because if the bandolier charges were ignited, literally you would explode, but also you would risk to ignite the bandoliers of the guy standing next to you. So, generally speaking, this reduced the front line, right? And so just the amount of shots that could be fired at a given moment. So if we, in fact, were to read the ideal according to the Dutch and French treatises, the optimal formation, that is a battalion of 500 musketeers, had would have had the impressive capacity of a rudimentary machine gun, right? Firing 50 shots every 20 seconds with a useful range of 50-100 meters, that the enemy on the march with his pikemen would have covered in 1-2 minutes, so taking something between 150 and 300 shots, even though this wouldn't count the asymmetry of the formations, because of course the enemy would have had a similar a similar deployment. There was a specularity in pike and shot warfare. I mean, there were different ways to arrange the pike and the shot, but the proportions were more or less the same, so you could have more or less invented. But at the end of the day, you had to, like, if you had just light infantry, like the shot in front of the pike, the shot was still not able, even with this optimistic fire rate, to take out the pikemen. As we will see now, this is not what happened for real. But they were just experimenting, like saying, what if, we had really a perfect formation, could do this, like, and we talked this over and over again. Also, for example, about the Prussian infantry of Frederick the Great in the 18th century. Nobody trained essentially the troops to be precise in combat. They trained them to shoot mechanically like crazy, just more or less aiming in the direction of the enemy, because that's what statistically made, under the pressure, in the chaos of the battle, the actual effect, right? At least if you were there to stand shooting, then you could also bayonet charge. But this is for saying how really messed up, and also the situation was in combat, but also how abstract, or at least very sort of idealistic these theoretical insights really were. Let's remember this from guys that were actual veterans, actual commanders, professionals, so not people that were writing this immediately just for fantasizing, because they said, well, if we try to channel our forces in that direction, things should improve. doesn't matter if we don't get there, right? And doctrine was evolving to some important extent. And consider also that the 500 musketeers had a front, naturally not all, as we've seen here, basically in 10 lines. So 50 men on a front that had to be at least 30 meters. That was already very, very packed, and would have been, in fact, even more like in a more stretched out in a realistic context. As we've seen, some of these guys had found a way to shoot one by one, like by jumping, like in a dance, during like passing just behind the corridor between front of the corridor between two pikeman units. There were all kind of experiments, but combat reality would come to mess up this further, because during the battle, the volleys would just become less frequent, less impactful, because weapons would just jam in some way. They would fail. We talk about this in the video about the potential of 30 years war firepower, and like the fire rate was ridiculous in practice. Accuracy would decrease dramatically. You would be taking losses, so there would be less men firing. You would have to recompose the ranks at least to fire in single volleys that could hardly be maintained overall. Without mentioning that the musketeers cost, right? Muskets were a relative novelty by that point. At least they were the heavier type of handgun that had evolved from literally mobile artillery, and that was, again, all a problem to properly to load in combat. It was so heavy you had to plant a fork like on terrain to, as you know, to handle it. And especially it was not just costly per se as a weapon, but gunpowder was more than else, even more than projectiles, the single most expensive thing that had to be sort of industrially gathered in some way, at least in large quantities by that time. And you had to have broader, expenses for that, connections, etc. One of the reasons why, for example, the pikes were still decisive, the heavy infantry was still decisive, is that they cost less, and that, yes, at least ideally in close range, the musket is more effective, but again, it cost more, and it is still in this broader employment capable of taking out, in fact, the broader pikeman formation. So that's why, again, till the end of the 30 Years' War, you definitely don't see, say, the musket prevailing, even though the trend had been going toward that direction. It was an effort, especially to have this ever more large scale, sort of collectively concerted employment of firepower, but always with combined armed tactics, with the pike, with artillery, with cavalry, right? So all of this was just being understood, was being carried further. Like, it's not that just technology dictated these changes at all. It all stemmed from politics, from society, from these very peoples who fought to rationalize, to theorize this all. But still, it was not yet, and it wouldn't be for generations, the prevalence of the shot over the pike, the latter of which would disappear, right? Also, musketry training imposed to enlist only mercenaries and keeping them also in peacetime. This was just more convenient because these guys knew already how to fight in the first place. They would need, like the Dutch would need, thus more money for the weaponry, for the intensity of workforce. You had, again, to spend loss of your resources. And there was just a broader need, which, as we were saying before, was noticed by the Dutch, that is, quantity is a form of quality. You need to just increase the number of the battalions in order to be able to cover the battlefront. That is already at this point something between 1 and 3 kilometers. And if you don't do so, like, you're going to risk hard, for example, an outflanking maneuver carried out by the enemy. The more you increase the musket, the more cavalry tends to come back. This was very well understood by Gustavus Adolphus, but it was already evident here. Like, this previous generations had been the peak of infantry strength. Then cavalry was coming back. Already at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, cavalry was more important than it had been in the second half of the 16th century. Then you need lots of other, you need reserves, you need infrastructure, you need some fortified barns, bridgeheads, without mentioning that the linear formation, as we've seen, rendered the single trace of the front more vulnerable, right? So it sort of reduced, in turn, the same cavalry employment, because at that point, cavalry would have tried to outflank the enemy as well, but it had to be close enough, it had to have the space, and you needed just to reach it, to command them to do so, which the wider the front, the more complicated it was, and the same risk of outflanking would have rather had to keep cavalry in reserve to avoid that at least when a musketeer unit was destroyed by a cavalry charge, you could at least countercharge, but this prevented you from passing to the counteroffensive, which was sort of defensive mentality, and so giving the initiative to the enemy. So these were all the technical problems that these armies were having, and why these guys were toying so much with these, sometimes even geometrical, abstract, numerical, mathematical concepts, because they were trying to rationalize. They realized that there was an optimum, and that in spite of the messiness of war, they had to strive towards that order of some sort. The choreography term, the chorus, the chorlogen, as it was eventually vernacularized, of the musketeers, demanded, as we've seen, a very important synchronism of the movement. Consequently, this minute regulation of continuous training and formation of 500 men at the battalion level, to inculcate even just the automatic execution of the movements that, as we've seen in the videos about the Protestant ethos, were connected with this sort of personalization, the sort of dehumanization of the individual, the idea that you were under a greater good and that you couldn't do anything about that, at least if you were not a commander. It's just like the Protestant, the idea that work has no relevance. You can't save yourself by yourself, you have just to obey how the things go, and so this was seen how to, say, speed it up, like to inculcate discipline, because it was about the collective quality, not the individual one. So lots of stuff, but you understand that much of this was ideal. In fact, I would like to make a video showing how, let's say, for example, the Dutch would toy with this being largely on the defensive, and so having even a greater pressure. They feared to be annihilated by the Spanish. They were very entrenched. They could count their resources. They would make a lot of economy on it. This would teach them also in the future how to handle this military administration, and again funding the army in a consistent way. So it was sort of easier, right? But this wouldn't work at all on bigger armies that had to actually work out there practically, directly, say in the plains of northern Germany, like it would have happened during the 30 Years' War. And that's where the Catholics were actually kicking ass, just as much as the Spanish did in Flanders. practically most of the times the Dutch came out of their fortifications. A very different mentality to some extent. There is a draft of the Dutch regulation, the Krijgsboek, written in 1599 by Louis Brader, the Count John of Nassau, which was rehandled and improved by the Generalkwartiermeister, the mathematician Simon Stevin, living between 1570 and 1635, and by the first director of the military school, the captain that we mentioned before. We will talk more in other videos, Johann Jakob von Wallhausen, 1520, 1627. This guy was German from Danzig. We made recently a video about the Hanseatic League, and I also made a video about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Army organization that describes the important German militia of Danzig, the forces of the Commonwealth. And this draft from, again, originally Louis, would be published in 1607 in Amsterdam, and eventually republished very often by, in different translations and paraphrases in France, Germany, England, Switzerland, mostly like among the Protestants. There are different other sources that show engravings, famously enough, all the various geometric formation patterns and say order of, for example, of reload for the muskets, etc., are very famous. Right? For example, the tree of Jacob the Gain had a great spread. It remained relevant until the mid-17th century. The movement for the musket loading are identical in the Treaty of Gain as much as the in the work of von Kunstendlern, the Rülpfunst, that was published in Nuremberg in 1664. Right, so we're talking the time of Montecuccoli, and still you had basically drills that dated to that time. Also to show what the point, to prove the point that we were making in the other video, that not much had changed in terms of firepower during the 30 Years' War after all, right? Especially as far as technology was involved, strictly speaking. Yes, there were improvements, but they were extremely gradual in many ways, and at the end of the day, the essence of the reload remained substantially unchanged, right? And it's plenty of works dedicated to these kind of mechanical movements, if you want. They are ideal, but if you can give them to the soldiers, there are lots of illustrations that literally, you can't imagine how they just taught the soldiers, also the literate ones, how to look at and say, you have to do this and that, and we will talk perhaps in some other video in ultra in-depth fashion how to actually reload a musket that time. But overall, it's relevant just to look at these images and realizing what sort of effort for precision, for uniformity there was at this point. In the 17th century, we have really a few tens of works that overall, however, mean a lot because they are based on all this handling of weapons, and especially on infantry tactics based on the Dutch system. And this was surely very telling of how the Protestants were taking their pride in what the Dutch had accomplished. We will see better another time what this did consist in, what was actually there behind these treatises. It wasn't much of they were illustrating an actual tactic per se. They were actually seeking for consensus propagandistically, right, for the Protestant cause. But the spread, again, contributed dramatically, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, to sediment this idea that the Dutch had during the 17th century, on the basis of all of their previous accomplishment, sort of developed this new system. It was sort of the Dutch way, it must have been so advanced. Except, right, this was, as we'll see now, actually spreading also in non-Protestant countries. And it doesn't seem that, in fact, anyone here was particularly changing their way of war in a consistent way, or at least this was happening in parallel with one another. But the idea is that, again, the Dutch, the Swedes were ahead, right, and say the Spanish or the Imperials weren't. This doesn't turn to be the case, right, and actually the battlefield will prove that in many ways. In any case, we have between 1600 and 1691 16 works in German. The list is interesting. There are many. They have some have not been even published properly, but for example, we have already mentioned Wallhausen Kriegskunst. No, we didn't actually, but it's one of. Then there is the. This was also in different languages by the same Wallhausen, for example, in Italian. It was the language of modern Europe. Manuale Militare Oda Kriegsmanual. Right, this was published in Frankfurt in 1616. This tells you also how international these works were. Von Tropitzen, Kriegskunst nach königlicher schwedischer Manier eine Kompanie zu richten im Regimentzug und Schlachtordnung zu bringen, zum erst anzuführen, zu gebrauchen und in esse wirklich zu unterhalten. Frankfurt, 1638. There is the Schola Militaris Exercitationis, Cologne, 1639. Sutter, Kriegsmanual von Übung der Reiterei und Infanterei, Schaffhausen, 1664. Bender, heutige deutsche Kriegswaffenhandlung zu Fuß. So you see here, this was published in Allen 1665, all focused on the actual handling of infantry weapons, mostly. Not only. Here you see the Reiterei, as it's spelled, Reiterei, but it is mostly about the infantry. Well, you can't blame them. I mean, infantry was the decisive arm after all, but it's mostly overall the focus on them that, for many reasons, again, the instruction of these guys as well, how they were trained, framed, whatever, was requiring. We have 4 works in English. I don't know how many have been found in the meanwhile in my sources, but still, there are out there. We have other 4 in French, for example, the Sieur de Pressac, Discours Question Militaire, Paris, 1614, we're talking about it before. Beyond, in fact, Instruction Militaire, Lyon, 1617, Montgomery, La Milice Françoise, Beyond le Principe de l'Art Militaire. There is the same von Wallhausen's work, L'Art Militaire pour l'Infanterie, that was published in Frankfurt in 1615. So you see, actually, they wrote it in different languages: Italian, French, German, and of course Latin, as we will see. For example, there was Hermann Hugo, De Militia Equestri Antiqua et Nova ad Regem Philippum Libri Quinque. This was published in Antwerp in 1630. You have 3 in Dutch, 1 in Italian, 1 in Latin we just noticed. The Teatro Militare by Della Croce in Antwerp in 1617. We have von Wallhausen Alphabetum pro Rione Pedestri oder der Soldaten zu Fuß, Frankfurt 1615. You have other 8 works regarding cavalry in Italian, German, English, and Latin. In Italian, we have Massari Tiburtino Compendio dell'eroica arte di cavalleria, Benes 1599, Ser donati de vantaggi de pigliarsi da capitani in guerra contra nemici superiori di cavalleria, Rome 1608, Basta il governo della cavalleria leggera Venice 1612, Melzo regole militari sopra il governo e servizio della cavalleria Antwerpen 1611, Perliciari universale istruzione per servizio della cavalleria in tutte le occorrenze di guerra Venice 1617. Then you have von Wellhausen, Kriegskunst zu Pferd. So these are all the cavalry one. Darin gelehren werden die Initiatfundamenta der Kavallerie aller vier Teile, als Lancierers, Cuirassiers, Carbineers und Dragons. Frankfurt 1615. In English, you have Crews, military instructions for the cavalry, or rules and directions for the service of horse collected out of divers foreign authors, ancient and modern, and rectified and supplied according to the present practice of the Low Countries wars. So this was yet another Dutch-inspired thing. These all are, to some important extent. This was published in Cambridge in 1632. Etc. Right? So this gives you an idea of how much, like, even our understanding of, say, the warfare spanning from the late 16th, beginning of the 17th century, depends on this pretty large amount of works, right? Some of these sources are still in manuscripts. They haven't been, as far as I know, transcribed, published. Some of them. Of course, there are out there others that await to be discovered. They're not clamorous works, right? It would be interesting to some codicological, paleographical researchers to know, for example, who read them, who had them in their libraries. We have some works of this kind, also some prosopographic work that allows us to say, oh, look, that guy had a library with this work, and he knew that guy that had a library with that, and they went at war in the same place at some point. That sounds like a very promising field of research. I personally wouldn't ever venture in there, because I'm more art of war oriented from the battlefield, actually, which I think is the single most underrated thing. I mean, it's very easy. Like, if you wonder where the concept of military revolution stemmed from, it's exactly from this. Like, instead of studying the actual sources about battles and reconstructing them together with campaigns, you just read these manuals and pretend that that's how warfare actually was. It wasn't. We will see it now. Here we are pointing out the relevance of the Netherlands in all this, say, material circulation, and of course how the 80 Years' War had inspired these works, and how these were written by the same people who had been fighting there. But at the same time, the battlefield reality for how we can reconstruct them is much more interesting and much more messed up, right? And this is definitely an important lesson that one has always to bear in mind. What else to say? Our historical understanding, however, has been unavoidably influenced by this, and basically for years and years there have been scholars who said, oh, look, the Dutch invented a new way of making war. Are you sure? And what kind of way of making war this actually was, compared, say, to the Spanish, or to the Imperials, or even just to, I don't know, the Germans in general, the French. These are all things that you must answer, because otherwise it sounds like these guys updated this model to an abstract level that we can't contextualize historically, militarily, and everybody says, okay, yeah, these guys were so ahead, and in what exactly? Because it doesn't seem them to be there, right? Again, if you just have a general knowledge of the Dutch strategies of the 30 Years' War, you know that just operationally they couldn't perform certain specific tasks. They were limited in many ways, and so to which level of operations does this manualistic genre apply, right? And how did bigger armies work, for example? Well, we do have the answer of that during the 30 Years' War, and especially the one that we will see now emerges from the clash of the Protestant Germans that were fighting with these, at least having received this Dutch insight, and the Imperials that steamrolled them. So until the Swedes arrived, that again have a different model after all, in fact a much more coherent one, there is no such advancement, because an advancement should be met with success, and we do not see that, right? We see actually a Catholic preponderance. We even see that there have been lots of other manuals that were written, for example, like just you can reconstruct how the Tercio operated at this point, and you realize that pretty much they were experimenting with the same type of flexible units, increasing firepower and whatever, but historiography didn't consider this more than much, because in spite of what you may think history is, and I tell you as an insider, there is a huge gap, an enormous gap in the actual amount of military history that has been studied. Right? Any of you can access on YouTube much more engaging and visually rich and whatever content than mine, but none of them they're telling you about this. None of them are telling you historiographically how much. Of course, what they're saying is just a repetition of a simplified history kind of content, just to keep you entertained, mostly from a visual point of view. But how much of an enormous part of the art of war has not been studied at all, even the majority of it. You would think, I don't know, Western warfare, it's hyper-studied, right? Yes, it is. In certain cases, you can't really rewrite the history of the Second Punic War. You can't rewrite the history of the Battle of Waterloo. But if we are talking about European warfare during, I don't know, the late Middle Ages, the early modern age, there's a massive amount of virgin soil. And I personally have been making my career on this, and specifically on the fact that, I chose my own path. I diligently, through Schwerpunkt, I revisit all these topics that I read at some point, and I'm glad to learn new things. But I also stuck to my doctoral research, as most professors, most scholars do, because after all, it's easier. You can't write about anything. It takes an enormous amount of work. Even just writing a decent article takes really a long time, at least 3 months, right, if you really want to make it good, and more or less you draw it from the pool of information that you have always researched about. Not just imagine this on the same level on a national scale, like scholars of a certain country studying only their own thing, or whatever their previous history has channeled them into to learn, right, towards to learn. And never asking, never caring, sometimes not knowing the languages, sometimes not missing the diachronic and comparative overall understanding of all this, right? And already from these treatises, languages, they're so varied. You understand the same people at the time were writing in different languages so that all of Europe would read that. They're not trying to prevent the circulation of these books in, say, Catholic countries. Everybody's interested in that because, of course, the broader art of war is pretty much similar from one another, and everybody wants to know what's going on, just like today, right? You have military analysts studying the wars ongoing, and they tell you, oh, it's this and that, and most don't understand much about it. People understand even less, or nothing at all. And yet war does happen, and you have to understand how to fight it, but also how, and literally how it's being fought, because otherwise you cannot learn from that in the first place, and that's where military history comes into play. Also, von Clausewitz was a hell of a military historian, not just a general, right? And that's what the entire vom Krieg is actually about, a theoretical complement to mostly a practical experience that you had to gather from the battlefield. And if you're not a military man, if you don't go out to war, you don't see it firsthand, what you have is military history. That is a real history. Not video games, not what ifs, not whatever, but what actually happened in reality, which people seem to be ever less interested in because of escapism or weakness and similia. But I'm really glad we're talking about these topics. I am really looking forward to continue with this focus, especially on 16th, 17th century war, also the 18th. I really want to expand my content in modern age warfare. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.